Hi everyone. This is a talk that I gave to the Cambridge Jungian Circle in February 24. Um, I want to start by saying that I'm not an expert on any of the material that I'll be talking about. Um, this talk came out of a presentation I did as part of my project for the training with the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy. And I just thought I would upload it here as well. The main idea is to kind of trigger you to think about your own experiences and how you might think about those. The artwork you'll see on the slides, I've used courtesy of Ted Wallace, and you'll see the access to his website on the first slide at the bottom there. So if you want to go and have a look at it, please do. It's absolutely stunning work. So entering non-ordinary states of consciousness, whether that's through meditation or holotropic breathwork or by taking psychedelics, can sometimes give Kundalini-like experiences. And these can take us into deep psyche, which can be ineffable, chaotic, and intense. There are a lot of theories or narratives about these states. And I think of that in terms of sides of a mountain. You know, the approach you take to getting to the top affects the view you get and also your experience of the climb. And it can be difficult to translate these different narratives into one another. So I wondered if there was a point of resonance, maybe, as they refer to what may be an underlying core of experience. And I've taken that core to be experience of the numinous. I also wondered how safe it is to enter these states. Is there a risk of unleashing overwhelming powers in our psyche? And how can we contain this material, both for ourselves and if we're working for our clients? To engage with something that was alive in the depth of his own psyche, Jung developed a technique called active imagination, which is a process to access the deep sphere of the numinous. He looked at different esoteric practices like meditation, yoga, alchemy, ancient Chinese philosophy, and he thought that these were all based on different forms of active imagination. In 1932, he gave a series of seminars on Kundalini, and he explained how he thought the tradition of Tantra is actually a symbolic theory of the psyche. He agreed that experiences, or it agreed with him, that experiences of the unconscious are real and meaningful. And he thought it was aligned with his own understanding of the process of individuation. Western and Eastern psychology, he thought, are fundamentally different. In the West, we tend to focus on the ego and how that operates and interacts with the external world. And Eastern psychology focuses more on the non-ego, on a level of collective, more transpersonal, inclusive experience. And the ego can be seen as a potential hindrance to that experience. Jung was criticized for his view that Westerners should stay focused on empirical reality. He thought as Eastern practices work to dissolve the ego, we might lose our sense of having a distinct, individual, rational consciousness, and we might get lost in a state of absorption in the unconscious, a kind of participation mystique. He's actually thought by some to have missed the implication of self-awareness in the higher states of consciousness. But all the same, I think his thoughts on Kundalini as a direct embodied awareness of the way an personal, independent dimension of being influences us is very helpful. A consideration of Kundalini also helps us think about the role of feminine consciousness in our psyche and in culture and society as a whole. So first, what is Kundalini? It's a lived experience of powerful, subtle spiritual energy, and it involves a surrender to a deep inner process which can give healing and growth. It has a numinous quality, and it's been written about in Hindu and Buddhist tantric texts, for instance, tantric Shaivism in India from the 4th century onward. But other people knew about it, like in Taoism, prehistoric South American cultures, and more recently Theosophy, and for instance Wilhelm Reich's writings on bioenergy or orgone. So it's a cross-cultural phenomenon, not just in the East, and it's increasingly being experienced by Westerners, although they might have a slightly different experience of it from how it was written up in Eastern descriptions. Kundalini, or Shakti, as it's called in its cosmic form, is a subtle, non-physical, universal creative force. It's an energetic presence, a feminine consciousness that permeates all of reality. It's an archetypal process of embodied psycho-spiritual transformation, which is autonomous and self-directed. You'll have come across the metaphor of a coiled snake at the bottom of our spine. When it becomes activated, it rises up through our core, energizing our chakras and opening us up to subtle awareness. It moves through the body, through a network of lots of different nadis and meridians, which are energy conduits, of which the main 3 channels are the Ida, the Pingala, and the Sushumna. The Sushumna is the central channel, and along that, at the point where the Ida and the Pingala cross over, are the chakras, which are organ-like centers that interpenetrate the physical body. Jung thought of the psyche and body as being one whole. Psyche permeates our body, but it extends beyond it. And each chakra has 2 aspects, a gross personal dimension and a subtle impersonal one, which involves our mind, thought, intuitions, emotions, feelings, and other forms of energy. So there is a psychic dynamic dimension to matter, which is the subtle aspect of our embodied experience. As the energy moves through the chakras, which can be in an upward direction, but also a downward one, and it's not necessarily always linear, you become aware of objective psychic realities outside of your ego or your personal awareness. And you come to see that psyche is actually not our own. It's infused with content from the collective. And as you start to see that, your worldview changes. You disidentify from your ego to some extent, and you become more centered in the objective, impersonal dimension of experience. You start to live your life more aligned with impersonal values and with the self. So Jung suggests that chakras represent qualities of experience. They relate to stages of development in the process of individuation, which leads ultimately to realization of the self. The Kundalini process, like individuation, is a universal drive towards growth and transformation. And it's the self that moves the ego and drives that individuation. Dana Swain, who I'll say a bit more about in a minute, suggests that as both involve a priori archetypal energy driving a transformational process, we could ask whether Kundalini is actually an experience of the self. So a range of different people have looked at what Kundalini actually looks like when people experience it. One of the first people was Lee Sanella, a medical doctor in 87. And people have reported having feelings of heat or cold, internal light or sounds, varying amounts of pain, emotional, mental, and thought disruptions, detachment and dissociated cognitive states, experiencing the body as much larger than it is, and out-of-body experiences. I've had some experiences, and it begs the question of whether this really was Kundalini, of intense, challenging energetic states, which are also ecstatic and deeply satisfying. A sense of being seized by an overwhelmingly powerful, deeply feminine, intelligent energy which streamed or radiated through me. Inward vibration, shaking, changing heart rhythms, heat, physical pain, involuntary physical movements, straining, changes in breathing, and powerful emotional and dreamlike inner processes and emotional release. Different things can trigger Kundalini. Eastern practices, if you do meditation or yoga, near-death experiences, psychedelics or holotropic breathwork, and physical or emotional stress or trauma. But it can start up spontaneously. There's not always an identifiable trigger for it. It becomes problematic if people don't know what's happening. They're terrified, they might resist, they feel like they're going mad, and they might impose preconceived ideas onto the experience and try to control or force the process. Another problem is that other people might dismiss accounts of what they're experiencing or misdiagnose it as maybe having a psychotic episode, and people can end up being medicated or even hospitalized. Non-ordinary states can activate Kundalini because they relax our ego control and body armor. And as the energy moves through and clears the blocks, that can trigger intense emotional, psychosomatic, and spiritual experiences. Jung and other depth psychologists suggest that healing and transformation arises from changes in the relationship between our ego and the archetype of the self, which is the totality of consciousness. And that leads to our ego becoming more reliant on something larger than itself that it aligns to. Jung thought that that was essential for our well-being at a time of increasing spiritual alienation. So just to remind ourselves what Jung means by complexes and archetypes, because those concepts are helpful in thinking about Kundalini. Jung describes archetypes as a priori, universal, formative principles and patterns in the personal and collective psyche. They structure the way we encounter the world and have a deeply meaningful, awesome, numinous quality. We can't know them directly. We only know them by looking at how we show up in the world, how we experience the world. The archetype of the self is the center of the psyche. It can be seen as a God image in our core. The ego, on the other hand, is only the center of our awareness. Complexes are unconscious clusters of psychic content like memories, associations, and so on, around a core element with a strong emotional charge. That core element draws in material from both the personal and the collective psyche in line with archetypal patterning. The complexes are more or less autonomous, and we register them in an embodied as well as a mental way. One important archetype is that of the Anima. Jung called her the archetype of life itself. It's important in the context of Kundalini because they seem to be intimately connected. Jung describes the anima as the personal and archetypal image of woman in the male psyche, a feminine soul and complex, the counterpart to his persona. The anima has multiple forms which can be light and dark. She's man's deepest reality and his greatest threat. Until she's integrated, men tend to project their anima and follow her into an engagement with life, both her reasonable form-giving aspects and her terrifying paradoxes and ambivalences. For women, the counterpart in their psyche is the animus, and that has a similar function. Gareth Hill, a Jungian thinker, suggests that there are two aspects to the feminine which together encompass the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. On the one hand, there is the static feminine, which is a creative, regenerative potential of life, motherhood, the mystery of manifesting psyche or soul in material life. And this is linked to nature and preservation of life. It supports form. And there is the dynamic feminine, which dissolves and morphs form. It's the spontaneous, responsive, intuitive surrender to what is new, non-rational, and playful. It's linked to the creative, dynamic aspects of chaos, the creative synthesis of evolution. It brings wisdom through direct experience, which goes beyond language. Maria Papaspirou talks about Western patriarchy as being ego-based, and as such it feels threatened by feminine consciousness and it denies and oppresses it. Because of that, feminine consciousness has lost its guides and frameworks of mystery traditions and rites and rituals to channel it. She's moved into the unconscious, into the shadow. From there, she communicates fluidly through dreams, signs, and symbols, and these can't be captured by rational language. Maria suggests that to heal ourselves and society, we need to trust again in intuitive knowing, in surrendered, embodied being, and in the creativity of chaos. We need to reconnect with the anima mundi, the world soul, the intrinsic connection between all beings and aspects of creation, consciousness in matter. We need to restore feminine consciousness to its place in our individual and collective consciousness, to restore the balance of masculine and feminine. Maria speaks of femtheogenic consciousness, which refers to the way that expanded states give access to feminine consciousness and to the feminine archetype. Femtheogenic consciousness taps into the depths of the psyche and re-enchants matter, whether that's nature or the body, and it restores the link between matter and soul. And of course, that's also what is said of Kundalini. So Kundalini is an individual form of Shakti, the cosmic, divine, feminine, foundational force of manifestation. Dana Swain, in a PhD thesis in 2019, suggests that we can think of Kundalini as an anima image, a call to a process involving death and rebirth as it manifests and transforms us. And it can feel like a death because it involves a total defeat of the ego and a surrender of our smaller personal will. We are drawn by the self into the depth of our inner world as part of individuation towards wholeness. For Jung, the anima and animus were linked to gender. But in Tantra, the feminine principle of Kundalini lies equally in men and women. Kundalini as a quality of consciousness reflects the feminine aspect of Eros, a more immediate, non-rational, intuitive, embodied, experiential, relational way of knowing. It involves a Dionysian movement of wild abandon to instinct and deep feeling, and as such it can lead to madness and tragedy as well as ecstasy. It integrates the masculine and feminine energies in our psyche and potentially balances out our Apollonian logos-based Western culture. Claudio Naranjo talks of three polarities of consciousness in meditation or in non-ordinary states generally. Each continuum runs from a more Apollonian, solar, rational state at one end to a more Dionysian, lunar, intuitive state on the other. So the three polarities are not doing versus letting go, mindfulness versus God mindfulness, and non-attachment versus love. And versus is really the wrong word. These are continuums and just two poles of this continuum. So the not doing, letting go runs from restriction and stilling the mind, which is more Apollonian, to letting go in a Dionysian sense, a suspension of ego or of the default mode network, and a surrender of control, which is this ego death. And that gives an expansion of mind beyond our normal, restricted ways of seeing and experiencing. And that results in a spontaneous, dynamic, experiential flow. Mindfulness, God mindfulness, is a continuum from concentration on perception and emotion, the Apollonian end, to a focus on symbolic content to evoke a sense of the sacred, the more Dionysian end. Experiences of here and now, as in mindfulness, and visionary states, as in the sense of the sacred, can merge to give ordinary things a sense of numinosity. The continuum from non-attachment to love, Naranjo thought shows up in the different effects that different types of psychedelics seem to have. LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT type psychedelics induce peak experiences that tend towards experiences of universal love. Other types of psychedelics like ibogaine and ketamine tend more towards cosmic indifference. Meditation and psychedelics are therapeutic because they suspend our conditioned personality, and that's what frees the deeper, self-regulating organismic process. But, Naranjo says, we need caution. Indian tantric tradition seems to be more Dionysian practices of surrender, love, God-mindedness, and devotion. But they're actually built on an Apollonian practice, a yogic complex of practices of tranquility, non-attachment, and bare attention. So they assume a foundation of Apollonian practices to then develop the Dionysian, more expansive awareness. Psychedelics involve a surrender through ego suspension or a kind of ego anesthesia, he says. And that means that actually what we get are only states of consciousness rather than stages of consciousness. And we experience transient activation of Kundalini. And he says that's still valuable and it's growthful and it's an initiatory process and can be a powerful motivational force, but it's not necessarily a stable attainment. So just to look at what Jung says about numinous experience, which is, just to remind ourselves, what I've taken to be the core of the mountain and a possible point of resonance between the narratives as they try to describe it. Jung says that archetypes are the numinous structural elements of the psyche, which have a compelling force, which they derive from the unconscious. The complexes assume an archaic and mythological character and a certain numinosity, which, if I understand it correctly, comes from their archetypal structuring. And then about numinosity itself, he says it's wholly outside conscious volition. It transports someone into a state of rapture, a state of willless surrender. And the experience of Kundalini can have this kind of ecstatic, numinous quality. The possibility of the numinous experience of a field of being beyond ourselves aligns with current thinking on energy and consciousness. Quantum theory and the hollow movement, which started in the 70s, suggests that there is one integrated, interconnected universal field of consciousness and relationships. David Bohm suggests that everything has two aspects, an explicate, physical and observable one, embedded in an implicate, non-physical one. And this involves a non-local consciousness which is primary and not separate from matter. So all matter arises out of this field of consciousness. Jung's concept of synchronicity, which is an inner experience connected to outer events in an acausal but meaningful way, supports the idea of an underlying non-dual reality beyond time and space, a continuity of psyche. And of course, tantric texts had already referred to this continuum of mind in matter. So, in addition to looking at Tantra, Jung also studied Western alchemy. He says the outer physical chemical processes in Western alchemy mirror the inner psychological stages of individuation, in the same way that he felt the Kundalini process mirrored individuation. Both processes decentralize the ego and lead us to see ourselves and life more objectively. So Jung thought alchemists projected consciousness into matter. Dana Swain actually suggests that the practice of Tantra and Kundalini is the Eastern equivalent of Western alchemy. Kundalini is like the philosopher's stone, the third thing that drives the alchemical process towards wholeness. It's more than a projection of psyche into matter. Psyche actually infuses matter, including our body, with a sense of numinosity. Marie-Louise von Franz suggests that you experience consciousness and living presence in matter by a meditative sinking down into feelings and sensations of the body-mind. So Jung, in his seminars on Kundalini, says a lot, gives a lot of detail on how he understands the different chakras and how they match up to stages of development in the process of individuation. I'm only going to give a very slight summary of each of these stages, just to give you a flavor of how he approaches it. The Muladhara chakra, which is near the coccyx, is the earliest stage of development. Our awareness is based in the ego and the everyday world of the five senses, and the dimension of non-ego or self is largely inactive. Then at some point, fascination or pain draws us into the unconscious, where our ego faces annihilation. That's the stage of the Svadhisthana chakra. ego-facing annihilation then leads on to the experience at Manipura chakra, which is the solar plexus. At this point, we just have to yield to subtle, transcendent experience, including powerful, irrational, emotional shadow energies. We experience intense, painful conflict, and massive energies are released. That leads on to the Anahata chakra, which is in the heart region. At this point, we start to identify with a more impersonal, objective dimension to our being rather than our thoughts or our feelings. We see that we are embedded in our body and in a wider field of values, ideas, and convictions that influence us, the collective unconscious. This is the start of individuation, as Jung sees it. We see how psychic reality influences material reality. A good example of that is psychosomatic illness, or maybe when people have somatic experience of the abstract notion of energy. The next stage is the Visuddha chakra, which is in the throat region, where we come to see that psychic reality is actually the only reality. Psyche, our imagination, our concepts and feelings, creates the external reality of our lives. And that stage then leads on to the Ajna chakra in the brow, which symbolizes pure consciousness. You experience your own psychic reality as contained within a larger psychic reality, which is not you, whether you call it God or Source or Brahman or whatever. The final stage of the Sahasrara chakra in the crown symbolizes a dormant state without differentiation or experience. There is only God or Brahman. But remember that Jung was criticized for not giving due weight to a level of awareness in these higher states. So it may be that this is an example of where he thinks of it as a complete losing oneself in the field, and a loss of any kind of awareness, whereas in fact there is still a special level of consciousness present. So Dana Swain is a Jungian psychologist with personal experience of Kundalini. In 2019, she wrote a PhD thesis called Revisioning Kundalini, exploring experiences of Kundalini from a Jungian and archetypal perspective. And she reworked that into a book called When the Light Breaks Through in 2021. She saw that a lot of what had been written about Kundalini had been conceptual and theoretical, and she really wanted to drill down into people's lived, embodied experience and the related psychological challenges. So she interviewed 5 Westerners about their experiences of Kundalini to answer questions about how depth psychology might help to understand and integrate Kundalini experience, and by converse, how Kundalini might help depth psychology understand the way numinous experience changes us. She also looked at how experiences are communicated. So how do these accounts of numinous experience impact on communities and society as a whole? So Swain asks an interesting question, and of course we can't ultimately know the truth of this, but on the basis of the process that he describes in his Red Book, she wonders whether Jung actually had an experience of a form of Kundalini awakening. She certainly found that her research confirms a synergy between insights from depth psychology and those from Kundalini. Kundalini acts as a transcendent function, It resolves opposites in the psyche and unites transcendent and embodied awareness. Synchronicities, she found, increased in her participants during times that Kundalini was active. And Kundalini had a transformative power. It makes you aware of the psychological complexes and experiences of the intermediate realm, as Winnicott and Kalshet describe it. Experiences of the numinous or God are of central importance because of the meaning such experiences have for people and how they affect someone's personality. She also found that people with early childhood trauma might initially experience Kundalini as a threat, which makes sense because Kundalini brings up the wounds that need healing, and that can trigger inner resistance, our defenses, the self-care system that Kalshet writes about. Swain suggests that Kundalini is a connection between ego and self that is present in the physical body as somatic phenomena, in the psyche as image and feeling, and on a transpersonal level as numinous experience resulting in psychological change. So I wondered whether could this interpenetration of levels be thought of or experienced as a complex, as a Kundalini complex. Chris Beisch reminds us that Kundalini energy and complexes, of course, are fundamentally different categories of thing. A complex, as we saw, is a temporary psychophysical memory construct which can be healed and dissolved, and its elements can be reabsorbed into the psyche so that it loses its power. Kundalini, on the other hand, is a flow of subtle life energy that saturates our body-mind. So you can't dissolve it. You can't make it go away or reabsorb it. Complexes are not inherently numinous, he says, but Kundalini can activate the chakras, which exposes and engages the complexes that are lodged there, and that's what gives the sense of the numinous. But I still wonder, even if complexes are lit up by Kundalini energy, could the resultant experiences of the numinous not still offer a point of resonance between the different narratives as they try to describe it? And could, triggered by the intense experience of Kundalini and drawing on personal and cultural material patterned by the archetypal energy, a Kundalini complex not form? Jung spoke of an Eastern and a Western psyche, depending on how central the ego is. So maybe an Eastern form of a Kundalini complex is becoming more accessible to us in the West because we're exposed to Eastern spirituality and practice. And maybe we're now attaching our own unconscious personal and collective content to it, so that a new Western form of the complex is being constellated. And this new complex might make it easier for us to experience subtle Kundalini energy, as increasingly people do. So having looked at what Jung and others say about complexes and Kundalini, I went back to my own experiences to see if I could find a resonance there. So from my notes, I've just selected little samples, but from my notes I'll give some shortened accounts of Kundalini experiences, some mandala drawings done after holotropic breathwork, psychedelic and Kundalini experiences. And I'll show you how I tried to order the material to see if there was some resonance between the different theories at points of numinous experience to form a bridge between them. Some of the material that came up, such as encounters with the devil, becoming a vampire, having things implanted into my body, was terrifying to me, until I started to be able to disidentify from it and to see it more as information that was coming out of my deep psyche and perhaps even the collective unconscious, and not simply pertaining to my smaller sense of self. So these three statements follow experiences of holotropic breathwork. There was one time of a sensation of wind or energy or a river running through me. Another time I was concerned that I would be opened up and if I let the energy run through, it might burn me. And I heard an inner voice that said, the blocks are illusory and you can take the energy. And another time I was flooded with energy, which was incredibly intense and had problems stopping the flow. And I felt totally mind blown and scared. And I lost the sense of who I was. This was an experience where I had a sense of containment, presence, and holding. There were beautiful images like symmetrical mandalas, a triangle in a circle, brilliant light, and there was a feeling of being taken or having given myself over. And Kundalini energy rose until I arced, especially early on in the process. When the energy hits a block, I would arc. The next two descriptions are of what I think are examples of complexes being activated. So Kundalini-like energy came arcing my back, and I felt like I was suspended, held in a cocoon. I was barely breathing. I felt connected with other times I've been abandoned, that somehow I'd made a life decision that crying is futile, expressing anger is futile. My feelings were in a capsule and inexpressible, unreachable. I felt like an infant retreating inwardly almost to the point of death. Here again, I felt myself falling backwards into nothingness. Something was attacking me, maggots were eating me, I was in a battlefield, everything was chaotic, I was being trampled. At one point I felt like a fetus in space, like a burnt skeleton. The chaos got stronger and I was still falling. And then there was a point where music no longer made sense to me. I couldn't interpret it as music, and it was just chaotic, hostile sounds which were totally overwhelming. And I was blown apart by terror. My body was dissolving until I didn't exist anymore. Here I had a sense of something going up through my rib cage into my skull and boring out through the crown. I then had a sense of searing light going all the way through, bleaching the bones and eventually dissolving everything. I turned to powder. And for a while I just was without a body. And then I felt a tingling and energy rising up and had an experience of bright white light inside. And there was a period of nothing. I was in a black space, nowhere. I felt stuck, cut off, and terrified. This, I think, was an example of maybe how the resistance or Kalshed's self-care system operates. It was during holotropic breathwork, and I had a terrifying fear of something that lay behind a curtain. And I was really trying to see what it was, but I just couldn't break through that curtain. The final experience I'm going to tell you about was a high-dose psilocybin session in Holland, where it's lawful. And it involved increasingly intense energy and an intensity of light and colors that were hard to bear. I was flooded with waves of energy, and my body, my hands were moved into certain positions. It felt like to help me open and bear the energy. I felt taken over by something divine, a goddess energy, And a number of times I was seized completely, feeling energy pour through me and out of my hands, which were burning hot. In fact, all of me was burning hot. And I was very clear that it didn't involve me, my small sense of self, at all. My ego was just on the side somewhere. I was just a channel or an occasion for the energy to manifest. And I actually think it was partly the collective field of the group of people I was in. This was the training group that had worked together quite deeply for 2 years. So there was a very strong bond of trust between us all. And I think my experience was possible within the container of that group field. So this is just an example of how I've tried to make sense of my experiences. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I tried to fish out aspects of experience that seem to indicate a complex or a coex, a system of condensed experiences, as Stan Grof calls them. And then I looked in more mental experiences and more embodied experiences, which were more associated with Kundalini, and tried to see if there, how they related, if there was any overlap, any resonance between them. I'm not sure how successful this approach was, but anyway, that's how I try to make some sort of sense out of my experience. So it did feel like the theory was borne out by my experience. I could recognize complexes, maybe coming out of early developmental circumstances, and I could see the way aspects of experience had split off and created forms with an archetypal charge in the intermediate field, my personal unconscious. And that fits with my defenses and character structure. Kundalini moving through the chakras did seem to bring these complexes out for integration. And the process, while Kundalini was active, involved a kind of deeply immersive, experiential, dramatized thinking similar to Jung's active imagination. So we often think of integration as a process of making unconscious material conscious, finding a meaningful narrative for it. But that may be a largely mental understanding of the process. It seems that the experience of Kundalini, as it activates the complexes, offers a corresponding non-conceptual embodied experience. So Jung says the physical and the psychic are once more blended in an indissoluble unity. The subtle body is a kind of invisible somatic unconscious. And Swain says that chakras are points where subjective experiences of space and consciousness are co-located and interpenetrate the physical body. And Marie-Louise from France, as we saw, suggests that working with the body shows the living presence in matter. So maybe we can talk of integration as the mental side of a coin of which experience of Kundalini is the non-conceptual embodied side. And of course, we all have Kundalini. Kundalini is a universal, vital evolutionary force. It's active in all of us, whether we register it or not. Maybe we don't always feel it because we're more or less defended, distracted, perhaps we're not really tuned in to registering the experience. And I know people sit for years to experience Kundalini, but maybe things like breathwork and psychedelics are such powerful tools that we can drop into a layer of the psyche where the ego is less active or relevant, so that we experience the energy incidentally, if you like, and then can go back there more easily. Maybe we form new neural pathways. So coming back to my question about how safe entry into non-ordinary states of consciousness is, psychedelics and other ways of entering non-ordinary states of consciousness are Kundalini activators. And you can feel like you're caught up in a riptide into a field of archetypal gravitational pull. Jung would say that the Dionysian intense call to journey and surrender is a call to the self, part of the individuation process, and we do need that. But it may take us out faster and further than we're able to hold or integrate. We may need our defenses sometimes. The experience of inner wounding infused with archetypal energy might re-traumatize us and actually intensify our symptoms and bolster our defenses rather than opening us up. Because psychedelics are an external trigger for loosening our defenses, that may make managing the opening more difficult, and temporarily dissolving our ego structure for some might leave our egos weakened with too much archetypal penetrance, which can trigger a spiritual emergency. Maybe you can even have too much God resulting in a kind of deep existential longing. So we need to balance the potential gains of a Dionysian surrender with structures to maximize safety and minimize harm. In work with psychedelics, they always emphasize the importance of set and setting being right, and good preparation and integration. And I think we do need channels of containment, both for the individual and for society. So finally, to conclude, I think we can think of Kundalini activation as an expression of individuation or an inner healing tendency or movement towards growth. If Kundalini energy is archetypal, maybe a Kundalini complex can form in alignment to it. And the notion of a Kundalini complex may be useful because it bridges different narratives, and it may make experiences of the numinous, the core of the mountain, if you like, less frightening. Mental forms of integration and the embodied experience of Kundalini seem to be two sides of the same coin. And maybe engaging with the experience of Kundalini and other non-ordinary states resembles active imagination. Maybe it's the experience of the numinous as complexes are activated that make non-ordinary states healing. So that was the end of my talk. I hope you found it interesting. I just want to say again that I'm really not an expert on any of this material, so I don't know if the way I've understood it or the conclusions I've come to are correct. But I hope it will be a prompt for you to think about your own experiences and how you make sense of those. What do you think, for instance, of the concept of Kundalini, and have you experienced anything like Kundalini? And what do you think of Kundalini as an Eastern way of experiencing individuation, the action of the self, or an inner evolutionary or healing tendency? And what do you think of the notion of a Kundalini complex? Is there a Western version becoming constellated, which allows us easier access to the experience of Kundalini? So, if you want to use these slides in any way, perhaps as a prompt for discussion in a group that you're involved in, I'm very happy for you to do that. I really hope that this has been helpful in some way. Yeah, and thank you very much for listening. And these are some of the books that I found useful. I mean, there is so much written on all this material, which is wonderful stuff. So I can recommend any of the books on these next couple of pages. Thank you very much for listening. All my best.